Hello and welcome to Raisina 2025 Ideas Pod. We have a very special guest with us today, His Excellency Péter Szijjártó, Minister of Foreign Affairs and Trade, Hungary. And we are here to discuss European politics, how Europe is changing, the geopolitics surrounding transatlantic relationship, what it all means for Hungary, what it all means for Indo-Pacific, and perhaps what it means for Hungary-India ties. Excellency, if I can begin with the big picture question here, we see and talk about these days a lot about disruption. And disruption, of course, has been happening for a while. We know that conflicts have been raging across the world, particularly in Europe, where there was an expectation that conflicts would not come and geopolitics would not enter. We've seen a turnaround. And therefore, as you look at the world today, at particularly the European and European periphery, how do you assess the evolving geopolitical environment? Is it becoming worse, or are we seeing some sense of normalcy returning with all the talk of a peace process between Ukraine and Russia?
Well, we have been living in the shadow and the neighborhood of the war in Ukraine for 3 years now. And we have been confronted with many challenges and consequences of this war. And on top of that, Europe, the European Union, has totally messed up its reaction and its policies towards this war. And the situation seemed a bit hopeless, to be honest. But with President Trump winning the elections in the United States, this hope for peace and normality to come back to international politics has returned. So now I see the situation hopeful, at least more hopeful than ever before if we put into consideration the last 3 years. The Western world has got a new leader, basically, a new leader who stands up for peace, who goes bravely and openly against the international liberal mainstream, a leader who goes clearly and bravely against the woke ideology, and a leader who brings back common sense, rationality, and mutual respect into international politics. On top of that, if you look at the policies of the Hungarian government for the last 15 years now, you see that basically we were Trump before Trump. Because we were always against illegal migration. We were always in favor of the families. We were always against the aggressive LGBT propaganda. And in the last 3 years, for the period of the war, we have been in favor of peace. So very similar to President Trump. That's why we were happy that he won the elections in the US. And I think that the patriotic political forces of the world can be happy now, seeing the outcomes of the first couple months of the second Trump presidency.
But you would appreciate that there are a lot of countries in Europe who are also very concerned about the trajectory of transatlantic relationship in particular. And so how do you think Europe can generate a consensus within to tackle or to manage or to get some kind of an accommodation with Mr. Trump, who has some very dramatic ideas about the transatlantic relationship and about the future of, say, NATO? Where do you see that conversation going over the next few years?
Look, the fact is that Brussels has been overruled by the international liberal mainstream for the last couple decades. And if you look back to the last 8 years, basically, liberal leaders of European countries made a competition among themselves who can say more nasty things on President Trump during his first term in office and during his 4 years not in office. And we all know that it's not only these European leaders who remember what they said on President Trump, but it's President Trump remembering on what they have said on him. And I think that causes this kind of paralyzed situation of the European Union currently. European Union is simply paralyzed. European Union has basically phased out itself from the circle of the global players of global economy and global politics. and Europe has been losing a big bunch of competitiveness in the recent years. So how we can get along better with President Trump? Patriots in Europe must win elections, and patriots in Europe must get strengthened. You know, it's happening. After the last European Parliament elections, the group of the patriotic political forces was able to form the third largest group in the European Parliament. Now, what shows the level of standards of democracy in Europe can be seen easily on the fact that this third largest group in European Parliament is excluded from any functions, any major discussions in the European Parliament. So, but the patriots are getting stronger and stronger, and the stronger the patriotic forces in Europe get, the better the transatlantic relationship under President Trump will be.
And so, by and large, you do see, and you do talk about a sense of optimism, and you do see optimistic signs emerging on the continent. But in one area where Hungary, for example, might have to choose, like some countries, is these signs of tensions among great powers, in particular U.S. China. And Hungary has a economic relationship, very vibrant one with China, like many countries, like most countries in the world. How do you navigate this great power competition that is now becoming so central to the way perhaps the big powers are looking at the world and imposing their choices on the countries?
Well, maybe I'm not right, but I think it's not absolutely necessary that there's going to be a conflicting relationship between US and China in the upcoming period of time. I have two arguments for that. Maybe I'm totally wrong, but still. First, that President Trump has cut the financial sources of the former American foreign policy strategy, which was based on interfering into domestic issues of other countries. And he has replaced this former strategy by mutual respect and interest-based cooperation, which I think can be helpful from a perspective of a balanced American-Chinese relationship for the future. Plus, my second argument is the track record of President Trump during his first term. Because President Trump during his first term was able to make such deals which no one expected. I mean, who would have expected the Abraham Accords to be completed? Who would have expected Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates signing the Abraham Accords together with Benjamin Netanyahu in the garden of the White House? And similarly to that, President Trump was almost able to complete a trade deal between US and China at that time, you might remember, but then the term was over. COVID came and the term was over. So what I do believe is that there might be a chance for a balanced US-China relationship. I understand that they are pretty much interdependent when it comes to economy. Well, to be honest, if they get along well with each other, that's good news for us, because we are a small landlocked Central European country, a country where export represents around 80% of GDP. So for us, the functioning of global trade and global economic system is vital. Therefore, any kind of trade war between big economic powers of the world is bad news for us. So therefore, we hope that US and China get along well in the future, putting into consideration that they are among the top investors in Hungary, number 2 and number 3. And they are the two most significant trading partners of ours outside of European Union. So it would be great if they could get along well.
And so this brings us to this question of Russia and the kind of relationship that Europe as a whole conceives of with Russia. Do you think now that a peace process is underway and the peace talks are underway rather, what kind of a security architecture do you envision for Europe where fundamental interests of both sides are protected and respected? Because a lot of this contestation around Ukraine has been about that fundamental respect for each other's sensitivities.
Well, first of all, if we speak about security architecture for the future in Europe, it is obvious that that can be constructed only through an engagement with Russia. Russia is a reality. Russia is there and Russia will remain there. So speaking about European security or European security architecture without the involvement of Russia simply doesn't make sense. So therefore, what we argue in favor of is the relationship between between EU and Russia to come back to the field of normality. Because cutting the relationship is one of the major reasons why the European competitiveness has decreased a lot. Because if you look at the basis for the European competitiveness and the development of European economy back 3, 5, 10 years ago, there was a combination of the highly developed Western technologies and the easily accessible, relatively cheap Russian energy sources. A combination of the two ended up in a competitive European economy. Now, since the European Union has been implementing totally inefficient sanctions against Russia, this model of economic growth is over and there's nothing new instead of that, unfortunately. So what happens now is that European companies pay 4 or 5 times more for gas compared to the American competitors, 2 or 3 times more for electricity than Chinese competitors. So how can you be competitive under these kind of circumstances? So therefore, from the perspective of Europe and from the perspective of the future competitiveness of Europe, it is vital that the Europe-Russia or EU-Russia relationship comes back to the field or to the basis, to the platform of common sense, normality, and rationality. We in Hungary always argued in favor of the channels of communication to be kept open with the Russians. We have offered Hungary as a place for negotiations about peace and ceasefire, like 2-3 days after this war had been launched. We have carried out, by the leadership of our Prime Minister, a peace mission last year, taking advantage of our presidency of the European Union, at the end of which we proposed ceasefire and peace talks. You cannot imagine how badly we were attacked for those. We were considered and judged and, lectured as puppet of Putin, spy of the Russians, propagandist of Kremlin. And now Europeans speak about why Russia doesn't accept ceasefire, So it shows to me very clearly that a rational approach would have been and is very necessary from the future perspective of Europe when it comes to economy and security both.
Excellency, but there is also a lot of concern in certain countries, particularly neighboring countries of Russia, European countries, about the future prospects of how far Russia should be engaged with. And so there is a concern in the Baltic states, for example, but it also is linked to this wider question that Europe is trying to answer about investing in defense and creating its own defense frameworks and infrastructure, and investing more now given what had been in the past. How do you relate this to and how optimistic you are that Europe as a whole would be able to sustain this momentum, given years of underinvestment in defense, suddenly propelling Europe to self-introspect?
Well, what's going to happen regarding the war, it does not depend on Europe anymore, I have to tell you. It depends on the US-Russia talks. So if the US-Russia talks are successful, if the Americans and the Russians agree on something, then peace has a chance to return to Central Europe. We have a very clear historic experience from the central part of Europe. Whenever US-Russia relations were satisfactory, our situation was better. Whenever there were bad relations between the US and Russia, our situation was worse as well. So we always pray for good US-Russia relations, because the better those relations are, the better our situation will definitely be. Very important that the major European leaders want this war to be continued, and they want peace talks to fail. I hope that the American will to make these talks successful will be stronger than the will of some European leaders to tackle the peace talks. And I do respect the feelings of other European countries, because I do respect their histories, and I know that history determines your feelings. And the countries which have been invaded by Soviet Union have different feelings compared to us, who have never been invaded by Soviet Union, invaded, quotation marks, just the communist regime. So it's different feeling. And we lost 4 decades of our lives. So I understand their feelings, but rationally, I would say Russia is not a threat to Europe. I don't see it in the future that Russia attacks any NATO member state. Why would Russia do so? I mean, NATO is much stronger than Russia. If Russia attacks a NATO member state, Article 5 is being activated, and then the outcome is obvious. Plus, I don't think it would be interest of anyone to provocate a third world war. And we all know that in case there's a direct Russia-NATO confrontation, it's easily third world war. So therefore, I don't think Russia poses a threat on Europe. I don't think Russia would attack any other European country. And I do believe that a security architecture of Europe could be agreed upon, but then it only makes sense in case Russia is around the table.
But your assessment is based on the fact that Mr. Trump will continue with NATO, his American engagement with NATO, because he's also given mixed indications about NATO. So you're optimistic about NATO's future as well.
I'm optimistic about NATO's future. NATO is the strongest defense alliance of the world, but I would like to underline the word defense. So it has not been created as an attack alliance. It has been created as a defense alliance. So any kind of attempt to drag NATO into a war outside of NATO territory is unacceptable for us. Totally unacceptable. When it comes to President Trump, well, President Trump has a very clear expectation towards allies to allocate funds for their own security. And I think it's totally understandable. Look, it was more than 10 years ago that a mutual commitment was made in Wales, saying that all allies must spend 2% of their GDPs on defense. Now there's still 25%, a quarter, of the NATO member states who are not complying with this commitment. And these are not the small countries, but the big and strong ones, the Europeans, and Canada, I think, as well. They are not complying with the 2% commitment. Hungary does. Central European countries do, even higher. So our situation is much better. But we understand President Trump's approach that we do have to spend on our own defense as well, reflecting to that, partly. There was an agreement among EU member states that we increase our defense spendings in a way that the European Commission will not take all the defense spendings into consideration when it comes to the calculation of state debt and budget deficit, which I think is a rational move. And then we'll see where does it end up, where it will end up. I remember the first summit President Trump took place, I think back in 2016, where he called for the allies to spend on their defense as well. So I think the expectation should be the same from his perspective.
Just rounding this off, Excellency, one final question. This was all Europe. Now, if you come back to nearer home to this part of the world, how does Hungary look at the transition happening here in the Indo-Pacific, and what are the foreign policy priorities for Hungary, both individually as well as part of the larger European landscape?
Well, I have to tell you that we value our relationship with India pretty much because we understand the similarities among our leaders and among our governments. You have a clearly patriotic government. We do have a clearly patriotic government as well. You do consider national interest as number one. We do consider national interest as number one. You are a peace-loving country. We are a peace-loving country. You have stood up for peace during the war in Ukraine. So did we. So there are many similarities which we respect a lot, and these similarities have been taken advantage of when it comes to building a great practical relationship between the two countries, including records in trade, including launching new air connections, including hundreds of Indian students studying on Hungarian universities. So the Hungary-India relationship looks very, very promising. And of course, that determines a lot our Indo-Pacific relationship as well, to which we attach a great significance. And so far, we proved to be successful, I guess.
Excellency, this was a fascinating conversation, hearing about Hungary and its priorities, particularly in Europe, but also the optimistic sense about the future that you have and that you bring to the table, and also your engagement with India. Thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Sir.